We have with us today Professor Will Steffen, Executive Director from ANU Climate Change Institute and Science Advisor at the Department of Climate Change, who will be speaking at the 8th Annual National Security Australia Conference next year on the 25th to the 26th of February in Sydney. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you.
Professor, it seems that the concept and definition of national security is changing to include less traditional threats such as climate change. Why is climate change now included in this concept?
Because climate change is a very pervasive issue now that is challenging some of the underlying fundamental ways in which societies operate in terms of how we grow our food, how we access water, how we indeed treat our waste into the atmosphere, and so on. When you get into a situation where you have a phenomenon that acts at the global scale and challenges society in such fundamental ways, it can lead to big shifts. It can lead to displacements of people. It can lead to some societies gaining and other societies losing from the differential effects of climate change. And all of these can create geopolitical tensions. The resource area is probably one of the most prominent ones in terms of dwindling water supplies in some parts of the world, too much water in other parts of the world, differential effects on growing food. And when that creates stress and eventually may create displacements of large people, that has obvious security implications.
So what are the impacts of climate change on Australia's security?
Most of the impacts I think we will see on our own security will be based on climate impacts in the region around us. Some of these impacts will be due to things, for example, like rising sea levels. We're already seeing impacts on our Pacific Island neighbors. We're seeing impacts on low-lying coastal areas, for example, in Bangladesh and so on. Now, one of the things people need to realize with sea level rise is it doesn't take much sea level rise to get very big impacts. When you have, say, a half-meter sea level rise combined with a storm surge and a high tide, you can get inundation events far more commonly than you could without that sea level rise, sometimes a factor of 50 or 100 increase in the number of these events. So we would expect, and indeed are starting to see, significant impacts on low-lying coastal areas. And remember, some of the big Asian cities lie on low-lying river deltas, so they're highly vulnerable. Second issue is water resources. Now here I'll give you a good example of where I think we'll see some security issues within a decade or two. And that's because the large Himalayan glaciers are retreating quite rapidly. And the latest projections are that they may disappear completely around middle of the century. Well before that, they will have big impacts on the water supplies for a couple of billion people. That's a large fraction of the world's population that rely on the large rivers that come out of the Himalaya. So as the flows change, as the water availability changes, that's going to create obviously some very severe challenges for countries like Pakistan and India, for areas of China, and so on. And so how those challenges are met may well lead to security issues in terms of people, displacement of people, people migrating out of regions where there's significant water stress, and so on.
What can be done to tackle the challenges of climate change that you've just described to protect Australia's national security then?
Well, that's a very, very challenging question. Climate change is such a fundamental problem and is so long-term that it's different from most problems that humans have faced in the past. So that means some of the traditional things like strengthening national borders or actions like that may well not work very well at all with climate change. Ultimately, the best approach, obviously, for the entire world community is to mitigate climate change. In other words, reduce emissions as fast as we can so that we limit the rate of climate change, we limit the ultimate extent of it, and we give ourselves some time to adapt in a timely fashion. If we don't get the mitigation challenge under control and climate change accelerates this century, we may well see security issues that is associated with displacement migration of large numbers of people that will simply be impossible to handle with traditional ways of dealing with security.
You're presenting at the National Security Australia event next year. What will be the focus of your presentation?
Well, first of all, I do want to make some brief comments about the nature of climate change because I don't think many people understand that this is a very fundamental problem. It's not a marginal environmental problem. It challenges many aspects of the assumptions on which we base contemporary society. So that's important. The second thing is we'll focus quite quickly onto some major impacts in the region surrounding Australia and what this might mean for some very fundamental human activities like production of food, water resources, livability of cities in low-lying areas, and so on, so that people get a flavor for what climate change may mean over the next couple decades and into the second half of the century.
Fantastic. We look forward to your presentation at the conference next year. Thank you very much for joining us today, Professor, and I will see you in February.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it as well. My pleasure.
Thanks very much.